So, welcome everybody. We have a very special guest today, author Daniel Dreisbach, who's going to be talking to us about this book, a fantastic book that I just got finished reading, Faith in the Founders of the American Republic, talking about what our founding fathers in the United States really believed when it comes to God, the Bible, and the role that those things have in society. And so, first of all, Daniel, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a delight to be here.
It's a pleasure as all ours. So let's just jump right into it and talk about some of these matters. By the way, I want to recommend anybody who's interested in these ideas to go check it out on Amazon or other fine history books are sold. So let's jump right in with some questions about the founding. One of the things, as a theology guy, one of the things that I was always kind of surprised about was a lot of people nowadays look at the founders, they call them deists. And I was really surprised. Not only were most of them not deists, at least from what I can see, but certainly not the way that deist is defined today as sort of this first cause withdrawn power that created creation and then sort of left things to its will. Even the most irreligious of the founders, it seemed to me anyway, believed in divine providence, believed that God's hand was helping them throughout the revolution. Could you elaborate on that a little bit for us, what the founders believed and sort of what the percentage ratios with the real devout to those that were less so, and then those that maybe were irreligious altogether?
Sure. There's a lot packed into that question. We might start with this question of were the founders deists? I hear that all the time as well. I think one of the challenges of that statement is what exactly do we mean by deism? It's if we think about deism as a belief system, it's a belief system without a set creed or authoritative text or a bishop or pope. It meant a lot of things to different people. And even in the founding era, I don't think there was a consensus as to what exactly was meant by that term. Now, you and I grew up in schools where we were taught the clockmaker God picture of deism, right? God
Yeah.
sort of created the world, wound it up, and left it to operate on its own. Now, if that's the definition that we are bringing to the table, then I think there is a case to be made that there were very few, perhaps none of the prominent founders were deists. All, including those who are very skeptical of the transcendent, the idea of God with his words of authority given to man. None of them would deny a God that on occasion intervenes in the material world. And they would see evidence of God's intervention, as you mentioned, in the war against Great Britain, where against rather remarkable odds, these colonists come out victorious. So someone like a Benjamin Franklin or a Thomas Jefferson give evidence of a belief in God who, at least on occasion, intervenes in the affairs of many nations. Now, a second part of your question that's equally challenging is, well, who do we mean by the founders? I tend to take a rather broad view. I'm thinking of a generation or two of Americans who began to articulate their rights as English colonists and believing that England is not respecting their rights as freeborn Englishmen, then agitate for and fight for independence. And then they have this enormous task of creating a new nation in the aftermath of independence. Well, this is a very large company of individuals. And I think it's going to be challenging to sort of put into numbers what percentage believe this, what percentage believe that. I think I would say that the founding generation reflected a rather diverse set of views on God and the idea of sin and the need of salvation, these kinds of concepts. I think they held a wide range of views. Did they accept the Bible as God's words? Again, a subject upon which there was some disagreement. But having said that, I think that a rather striking number were what I would call Orthodox Christian, and I use the word Orthodox small o. Oh, I'm not speaking of sort of the Orthodox Catholic tradition. I'm simply meaning those who take seriously the core tenets of the faith.
Sure.
Um, many of the founders held to, I think, rather clear Orthodox traditions. This would include people like a Patrick Henry or a John Jay or a Benjamin Rush. A significant number held these views. All in this generation, by the way, would have been well acquainted with the English Bible, the English translation of the Bible. The King James translation of the Bible in particular was an ideal tool for literacy education. So this is a generation of Americans that learn to read with a copy of the Bible in front of them. And so even though some of them may not have accepted the Bible as God's word, they nonetheless knew the Bible well. They understood the doctrines of the faith. They understood the major themes that come through in both the Hebraic scriptures as well as what Christians call the New Testament. They knew the Bible well, and it's integrated richly into their discourse and their rhetoric, and it shapes their habits of mind.
Right. That's I find that very interesting that whatever their theology was, personally, they certainly, it seemed, believed that the Bible was something that was going to be fundamental in creating a moral civilization. Even let's say irreligious people like Thomas Paine, for example, he still quotes biblical references in shaping how he's delivering his message to the masses.
Yes.
Right? Would it be fair to say that the Bible was perhaps the main source that would uh, shape the society in which the founders wanted?
Yeah, I think there's a case that can be made for that. I tend to acknowledge that there are a number of intellectual traditions and perspectives that informed the founding generation. There were aspects of Enlightenment thought, for example, that they were well familiar with. The John Locke, for example, they were
Yeah,
very familiar with the Republican traditions, going back to the ancient Romans as
sure.
well as more civic Republican thought, more moderns, people like a Machiavelli. They also drew richly on the English common law and English constitutional tradition. But I would place right there at the center of that mix a biblical tradition. Again, both the Old and the New Testament. Now, I think we can point to some very specific ideas that are largely shared across the board by this generation that's going to inform their political thought. For example, I think they by and large believe that man was a fallen creature. They read and understood what happened in Genesis chapter 3, and that's going to shape their political thought. So when it comes time to creating new governments, wherever they put power in one person's hands, they're going to check it. They're going to separate that power and check it by putting power in another person's hand. And again, that grows out of a biblical anthropology, a view of man as a fallen creature. They also believed in a future state of rewards and punishments. This is going to shape the importance that they attach to oaths and oaths of office and things like that. So they're drawing on some very powerful biblical themes that is going to shape the kinds of government they're going to create. I don't think you can create a government without first thinking about for whom is this government being created. And again, it's that biblical anthropology that I think is so vital to understanding the founding project, a view of man that is derived from reading the Bible.
No, that's beautiful, and I think probably another core issue, another core idea that is embedded in that is the Declaration of Independence itself that says mentions God or the hand of providence multiple times, that everyone is created equal, that and made in the image of God, and that this is where our rights come from God, not from government. So God seems to be a very strong fundamental idea in this separation from England and creating this new society that our freedoms come from ultimately a higher source. Um, I,
I think that's absolutely right. Sort of God is there at the center of this political thought, this political theory that they're building on. Let me give you some even more, I think, very maybe more minute examples of the influence of the Bible. Uh,
okay,
Consider, for example, the very idea of republicanism. A very common view in the American founding is that there is a vision of republicanism found in the Hebrew experience from the Exodus from Egypt up until the coronation of Saul. And they're interested in studying this history. They're reading Deuteronomy chapter 16, 17, and 18 to get a picture of what Republican government looks like. Now, again, we're speaking of Republican small r here, and to the
yeah,
founding generation, that would have meant this: government by consent of the governed as exercised through representatives of the people.
yeah,
And they see this vision in the very first structures of government that emerge once the children of Israel have passed over the Red Sea into into the other side, where we read there that all the authority of government is falling on Moses's shoulders. And you remember his father-in-law, Jethro, comes to him and says, Moses, you need some help. And they begin to flesh out what a
yeah,
system of government looks like. And they separate the people into groups of 10 and 50 and 100 and so on and so forth. Americans read that and they saw a picture not only of republicanism, but a kind of federalism, a separation of powers between central governments and regional governments. They read in Deuteronomy chapter 16, 17, and 18 about a separation of power between prophet, priest, and king. And this becomes, in a way, a model for the separations of power that we see manifested in our government. So this is a vision of politics that starts with a vision of God and a providential God who's interested and intervenes in the affairs of many nations. But it trickles down to some of the smaller details of how you begin to lay out a government. What does a government actually look like? And again, I think this is one of the reasons why the Hebrew scripture, especially the books of Moses, and in particular the book of Deuteronomy, is a favorite source that the American founders look to, because it lays out a handbook of how do you take a people who've just escaped bondage and then reconstitute them into a polity, a form of government in which they can govern themselves. And Americans see themselves in 1776 as God's new Israel. And
yeah.
so they see themselves walking through that same path. And they're going to look to the very handbook of the children of Israel in guiding them in trying to reconstitute a government having secured independence from Great Britain.
Yeah, I was always fascinated by this idea that the founders had this sort of vision of themselves as the new Israel, and that they inherited that even from the earliest colonists, the Mayflower and the Jamestown settlements, and the early colonies really sort of saw themselves. I remember reading some of their writings that they saw themselves as the 13 colonies are kind of like the 12 tribes of Israel
Right.
that are, all part of the one nation, but have their own sort of land area and governing rules that apply to them. So it's an interesting thing, and I think something that you said kind of unifies this sort of debate that you find sometimes, because one of the reasons I think that oftentimes, let's say, Christian fundamentalists and very secular people kind of talk past each other on this issue is because some in the camp of Christian fundamentalism will say that essentially the entire American founding was to promote Christianity and only Christianity, to found the country as a country that fully represents all of the theological implications of Christianity. And then you have someone who's a very secular person will say that there was no contribution of any religion. They wanted religion far from anything. And I think there's kind of a happy medium that can be made, that even even without the fundamental or orthodox lowercase o tenets of Christianity, there's no question, I think, that the founders had this love, appreciation for, and connection with the Bible as a governing power, a source for governance, and something that as far as the not only the structure of government, but as far as personal behavior is concerned, that this was the moral code to look to establish a moral society.
Yeah. Again, you make some really wonderful points here that we can sort of flesh out here. There's no doubt that, especially in New England, Puritan New England, in those early days, they thought that they were building Bible commonwealths. They wanted to sort of build new polities that were built on a biblical understanding of politics, and they looked to be very frank here, they look more to the Old Testament than to the New Testament for models on how to structure their government. But another fact, another reality that they had to contend with is that very early on in the colonial experience, America becomes a haven for the religious dispossessed of the old world.
Right.
It is the extraordinary diversity of religious sects that begin to come across the Atlantic creates its own sets of challenges. And Americans discovered very early on that they're going to have to think through creative policies of toleration, initially toleration, but eventually religious liberty. If all these sects were to live side by side without killing each other in the way that they had gone through a century and a half of religious wars in Europe in the aftermath of the Protestant Reformation. So very early on, colonists are thinking about how do we live together in a relative harmony. We see that beginning to play itself out in things like the Maryland Toleration Act at the end of the 1640s. Now, we got to be cautious here because words like toleration didn't always mean exactly the same thing then as it might mean to us today. But think
Right.
about that. In the 1640s, they're trying to work through policies of toleration. This is 40 years before the English Toleration Act. The colonists are grappling with these fundamental questions. And this process of thinking through toleration and religious liberty is ultimately going to blossom into Article 16 of the Virginia Declaration of Rights and the great Virginia statute for establishing religious freedom in 1786, and of course the First Amendment in 1791. Now, you raise another point that I think is so important, and that is from very early on in the colonial experience, but especially by the time we get to the founding era, Americans are looking to the Bible as a handbook for personal ethics, personal discipline, because this is the challenge they face. How do you maintain social order and stability in a system of self-government? Authoritarian rulers use the whip and the rod to compel a kind of social order. But Americans are rejecting that kind of authoritarian rule. And so the question that the American founders asked themselves is, what replaces the whip and the rod as an instrument of social control? And on this point, they look to an internal moral compass. They want to nurture internal moral monitors that are going to prompt people to behave in a disciplined way that will facilitate self-government. And they see the Bible as the handbook, as the textbook for nurturing those kinds of civic virtues that are going to be required if people are to be controlled from within as opposed to being controlled from without. I've come across a phrase a couple times in the founding era documents, and it always catches my attention. And that is a number of founders, John Adams, for example, once described the Bible as the most Republican book in the world. Okay, now think about that for a second. The Bible's the most Republican book in the world. Now, I've been reading the Bible for over 60 years, and I got to tell you, never once have I sat down and thought to myself, I'm going to do a little Republican reading now. What's he
Right.
thinking? Well, he's making exactly this same point. He says our great experiment at this moment of independence is to create republican governments, government by consent of the governed as exercised through representative people. So it's an experiment in self-government. And the whip and the rod, the external control whip and the rod, is inappropriate. And he says, what's going to nurture the civic virtues that a people required in order to engage in republican self-government? And he says, no book, no book does this better than the Bible. And so
Mm.
in that sense, the Bible is the most republican book ever written, right? There's a kind of a logic there that I think kind of escapes our thinking about the Bible and republicanism here in the 21st century. But they clearly understood that a self-governing people had to be a righteous people, had to be a people controlled from within. And they're looking to the Bible to nurture those kinds of virtues, that kind of public morality necessary to replace the whip and the rod.
Right. To your point, that's the famous John Adams quote where he says that our Constitution is for a moral and
That's
religious
right.
people, that you need a moral and religious people because if you're going to give people all these freedoms, carte blanche, you better make sure that they know how to restrain themselves and live an upstanding life. Well, let's slightly transition for a moment and talk about, because we're talking about the impact that church and state are that how they're supposed to interact with each other. In modern discourse, things like separation of church and state are understood in a certain way. In fact, many people will interpret the separation of church and state that there should be no church involvement in any public sphere because that would be somehow in a mix of church and state. So based on your research, how do you find that the founders interpreted this concept of the separation of church and state? And how is that different than the way that it's sometimes used today?
Well, of course, the language of the Constitution is not separation of church and state. It's the language of disestablishment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. And in the lexicon of the American founding, the notion of separation of church and state was very different than this language of non-establishment or disestablishment. Disestablishment is a more narrow institutional concept. What they're rejecting is the idea of an established Church of the United States in the way that every European nation at that time
Right.
had an established church. And I would suggest to you that in the founding era, at least, they would have been somewhat concerned or suspicious of a claim of separation of church and state because it would cut against the point we were making previously that they believed religion and morality played a vital role in their experiment in self-government. And so I think at the time of the writing of the Constitution or even the Declaration, they would have been somewhat concerned or suspicious of a claim of separation of church and state. Now, to jump ahead a couple generations, I think Alex de Tocqueville said this exactly right. You may recall he says religion plays no official institutional role in the government of the United States, but it may be the most important of political institutions. And again, he's making exactly the same point that to have a self-governing people, you have to have a people controlled from within by internal moral monitors. And no one made this point more famously or succinctly than George Washington in his farewell address to the nation. Remember, this is his parting advice to the nation. And the most famous line, at least initially from that address, the money quote, if you will, goes something like this. He says, of all the habits and dispositions which lead to political morality, of all the habits and dispositions which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. Right? That's a pretty strong
That's
statement.
a strong
Now
statement, yeah.
we typically skip over the next sentence, but he puts an exclamation mark on the next sentence. He then goes on to say, in vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these firmest props of human happiness. Now think about the implications there. That word indispensable is about as strong a word as you can think of, right? Religion and morality are absolutely indispensable to this system of self-government that we're trying to create here in the United States under the Constitution. And oh, by the way, if you're trying to undermine that religion and morality, you can't call yourself a patriot. That's George Washington.
It's a big
And
point.
I guarantee you, there's not a raised eyebrow when he says that, because that there was a consensus that this is exactly right. You're not going to find someone disputing, oh, by the way, you can't talk about this religion stuff because of separation
Right.
of church. It's an accepted axiom of the political thought of the age.
So the term separation of church and state is from a response from Thomas Jefferson to the Danbury Baptist Church, correct? And so this is where that wall of separation term that's often brought up is coming from. Can you walk us through what that exchange was like and sort of why it has this sort of far-reaching implications today that anytime and we use this as the sword of dismissal. Anytime anyone wants to show any sort of religious pride or celebration or gathering in public, it's at least it's brought to court if it's not completely chopped away right from the get-go. How has this, can you build for us what was the dialogue between the Danbury Baptist Church and Jefferson, and sort of why that has become now the sword to wield against anyone that wants to have any public expression of religion?
Right. Well, this can be a long conversation. I wrote a whole book on the letter to the Danbury Baptist.
Oh, okay. I got to
So
check that. Got to add it to the reading list then.
yes, I've been thinking about this for a long time. So,
Okay.
let me first say this, and I don't want to spend time on this except to say that this metaphor of a wall of separation has been a part of church-state discourse for at least 500 years in the Western world. We can go back to just sort of the immediate aftermath of the Protestant Reformation. You begin to see the use of this metaphor, but very importantly, it's not always being used in the same way that we attribute Jefferson's metaphor, right? We think of Jefferson's metaphor as a way of protecting public life, protecting the church, the state from intrusions of religion and the church, so to speak. In much earlier versions of the wall of separation, it's often used as a metaphor to protect the purity of the church or the religious community from external impurities, from
Government corruption and
government
whatnot.
corruption, the rough and corrupting hand of the state, if you will. Now, as the metaphor has come to exert influence in our own culture, it's largely come in through the law. And so Jefferson wrote this letter to the Danbury Baptists, and we could spend some time about the context of that letter. But for understanding the enormous influence of the metaphor, I think we have to jump ahead to the end of the 19th century, where the Supreme Court sort of slipped in a brief excerpt from that letter, including the wall metaphor into one of their opinions. It was one of the Mormon polygamy cases, if you will, if you remember those in the late 1860s. And then it kind of fell from disuse until the mid 20th century in a very important establishment of religion case called Everson versus Board of Education. The Supreme Court revived this metaphor and essentially said the First Amendment erects a wall of separation between church and state. And so for the next many decades, the wall, in some respects, supplants the literal language of the First Amendment. Now, I think there's some really dangerous implications, because I think what the language of the First Amendment does is very different than what a wall of separation does. But in any case, the wall emerges as this metaphor for the First Amendment, and the court elevates it essentially to constitutional law. So here we are in the 21st century, and it's hard to have a conversation about church and state without having to contend with this language of separation or wall of separation metaphor. Now, I think it's a problem, and I'm going to suggest some reasons why it's a problem. Because when you read the literal language of the First Amendment, it says Congress shall make no law. Now, whatever we want to sort of conclude that means, whatever the First Amendment does, it's a limitation or restriction on Congress or on government by extension. But if you replace the language of the First Amendment with a wall, it's a bilateral barrier. So now it's not only a limitation on what government can do, but it's now also a limitation on what the community of faith can do. It's
Interesting.
inhibiting the ability of the faith community to inform the public life, to inform even government. And I think this is to cut against the very point that George Washington's making, right? He thinks religion and morality have a vital role to play in promoting social order and stability, but a wall would act as a barrier to the ability of the community of faith to inform the state and the operation of the civil state. And I think that's a profound transformation. It's a mischaracterization of what the First Amendment stands for.
So if I'm understanding correctly, it sounds like the founders were very concerned with government getting involved in religion as opposed to religion getting involved in government. And the concept of the separation of church and state, which again is attributed to Jefferson, doesn't really have the implications that it does today until about, what, 80 years ago, based on Supreme Court decisions.
That's absolutely right. And I think we could go even further, and I'm not sure we want to push it this far. I don't even think the Supreme Court has quite understood how Jefferson himself was using the metaphor. I think if you read Jefferson's letter in which he uses this wall of separation metaphor, and you read it carefully and in its historical context, very interestingly, he's using the wall really to affirm the principle of federalism. He doesn't place the wall between church and state. He places the wall between religious societies and state governments on one side and the federal government on the other. In the letter, he's speaking to his powers as president of the federal government, and he's wanting to explain some of his behavior as president of the federal government. And the wall, again, is not between religion in all its forms and expressions on one side and government in all its forms and expressions on it. It's between the federal government and state governments on matters pertaining to religion. And that's a meaning of Jefferson's wall that we've lost completely today. Now, there are reasons for that. We've had some amendments to the Constitution that sort of alter how we generally view the First Amendment, like the 14th Amendment. But I think the true Jeffersonian understanding of the law has been lost completely.
Would it be fair to say that one of the things I find interesting about Jefferson's wall of separation and the fact that it's always thrown back to that is that, if I remember correctly, during the early founding years, because there were limited government buildings in Washington, D.C., church was actually held in the Capitol building, and Jefferson was a regular attendee. I think Madison as well was a regular attendee. And so, like, on Sundays, literally the state became the church, and Jefferson was going on a regular basis to church in the Capitol building.
Yeah, I think that's right. So that's one. You've given us one very good of many examples of the government, of public officials in the early republic doing things that courts today would find to be a violation of the wall of separation, right? Which raises a question, right?
Heads would explode.
Are they knowingly violating their own wall of separation? Or perhaps there's another understanding of the wall that differs from the modern vision that the Supreme Court has given us. I think the problem with the modern construction of the wall of separation is that it promotes a faith that is strictly private and a state that is strictly secular, right? And I don't think that that's the founders' vision. I think, in fact, it's utterly incompatible with the founders' vision of the vital role of religion and morality that it must play in a system of self-government.
I love this, and honestly, I could talk to you all day. Let me ask you one closing question, just for the sake of time, and maybe we could do this again in the future at some point as well. So, what lessons can modern Americans, especially those that are concerned about moral and civic decline that we've seen happen over the years, what can we draw from the founders' use of the Bible and their importance of morality and in civic discourse, in personal beliefs and actions. What can we draw from our founders in their use of the Bible in public life, according to your research?
Well, I think there are a lot of uses of the Bible. I think the Bible in a sort of religious expression was a vital sort of glue that held the society together. Not that long ago, we've gone through a presidential inauguration. Just think about the ceremony of the inaugural itself. It's infused with sort of religious liturgy and symbolism, and
Yeah.
the oath of office being taken on the Bible. I think they thought of this as a potential source of unity, of bringing people together. But more fundamentally than that, I think we should reflect. I know this is a challenging time in which we live, but I think we should at least reflect on this idea that was held almost without exception in the American founding era, reflected in that language of George Washington, that religion and morality are vital to self-government. And if we lose that role played right by religion and morality, what's going to replace it? And I think that's the crisis of
Mm.
our own time. I think we're struggling to understand if we deny a voice for those of faith, the religious voice in the public marketplace of ideas, what replaces the richness, the value that voice of morality and religion brings to the polity. And perhaps the crisis of our time reflects that we haven't thought through that challenge sufficiently. And maybe Washington is correct that a society that rejects religion and morality is going to be a society that loses its very foundations.
Excellent, excellent point. And that is a powerful question that we can all ask ourselves these days, is if a person or a society is going to push aside the Bible as the core moral force in our society, what exactly is it that's going to replace it? And we may not like the answer to what that is. And that could be, unfortunately, the source of a lot of our issues that we struggle with today. Daniel Dreisbach, author of this book and many others on this similar topic. I highly recommend going out, purchasing all of them, educating yourself on what the biblical, religious, God view was of our founders, make our country better by understanding where we come from. Because if we don't have a shared history, it's very difficult for us to have a shared destiny as well. Daniel Dreisbach, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope to have you back again.
Thank you, Rabbi Taylor, for having me. It's been a pleasure.